Have you ever had an idea on how to make a bad situation better, but after you enacted your idea, you found that it made the whole situation worse? Maybe there was some family strife where you brokered some peace between each of the family members for the betterment of the household, and for a time there was peace. But then, some of the rules that you put in place that paved the road to peace were misused and or misinterpreted by the family members for their own benefit. This caused each of the family members to resume hostilities, but now the target is not only each other, but you as well. Well, that's essentially the story of the formation of the United Nations. The old adage, the road to hell is paved with the best intentions, encapsulates the UN story perfectly. In this episode of the Office of the Patriot, I'm going to go into the inception of the UN, its charter precepts, and its gradual but consistent philosophical transformation from a good-intentioned peacekeeping organization to a globalist communist one. Hello, and welcome to the Office of the Patriot. In this office, I try to make sense out of the nonsense of the progressive left. If you are a subscriber, thank you for your continued viewership. It is appreciated. If you are a returning viewer, please take a moment to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any future presentations. And if you are a first-time visitor on my channel, well, congratulations on finding it. It's usually impossible to find thanks to the YouTube algorithm. However, I hope you find the content worth coming back for. My name is Myron Ybarra, and I'm your host. In order to talk about the creation of the UN, we have to discuss World War II, specifically the United States' involvement. The U.S. was drawn into the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor by Japan on December 7, 1941. And given that Germany and Italy were allies of Japan, both Germany and Italy officially declared war against the United States 4 short days after Pearl Harbor on December 11, 1941. Over 70 countries throughout the world were involved in World War II. It's probably easier to count the amount of neutral countries that did not involve themselves in World War II than it is to identify the Allied and Axis countries that were involved. In total, this war took the lives of nearly 15 million military personnel and over 38 million civilians. After a war of this magnitude, the world was tired of war and hopeful for a measure of peace. So representatives from various countries assembled in San Francisco on April 25, 1945, and convened the idea of a peacekeeping body comprised of members from allied nations to include China and Russia, more commonly known as the USSR. And after a total of 4 months of deliberation and ratification, the UN was founded. Like the United States, the UN has a preamble to its charter. This preamble, among other things, reaffirms faith in fundamental human rights, the dignity and worth of a human person, and the equal rights of men and women and nations, large and small. The founding goals of the UN include living together in peace with one another as good neighbors, agreeing that force shall not be used save for a common interest, and to apply international machinery for the promotion of economic and social advancement of all peoples. This last goal smacks of a world government philosophy, but we'll get into that in a bit. So let's get into the meat and potatoes of this topic. How does the UN employ its peacekeeping process? Well, according to the UN's principles of peacekeeping, there are 3 basic principles that continue to set the UN peacekeeping operations apart as a tool for maintaining international peace and security. The UN sends peacekeepers with the consent of the countries who are in conflict to the field to broker peace. This requires both countries to agree to a political process for resolution over one based on combat. The next is impartiality. The UN claims it strives for impartiality in dealing with other countries who are in conflict. And finally, non-use of force except in self-defense and defense of their mandates. And the mandate in this case is peaceful resolution of conflict. An example would be if leaders from both countries came to the table to broker a peace agreement and combatants from one of those countries attacked members of the meeting, the UN could use force to save lives and to quell the disturbance. To facilitate this, the UN has a Security Council comprised of 15 members, 5 of which came from the founding countries to include the US. The Security Council maintains authorization to use force at a tactical level with the consent of the host nation and or the main parties of the conflict. And as I see it, this principle alone has the potential to nullify the first two principles of peacekeeping, but also intensify the conflict, much like throwing gasoline on a fire to put it out. Can it work? Sure, but it's not likely. And the reason is because once force is used by the UN, the appearance of impartiality is out the window. Over the last few decades, the UN has started adopting its own mandates that appear more and more like the adoption of socialist and communist population control mechanisms. In fact, the UN even brags that they're doing new work not envisioned for it in 1945 by its founders. Things like Sustainable Development Goals for 2030, which is their big push right now, and a climate action mandates that are the UN's goals for world governments. Some of these goals include doing away with poverty, which at the surface seems like an admirable thing to do, but in reality, it's similar to the one I presented in episode 65, where you will own nothing and be happy. This is where government removes all ownership of property from its citizens based on the lie that ownership of property is a burden. Leftists claim if there is no more personal property, there would be no more poverty because no one would own anything. Everything you need to survive will be provided for you by government. You notice I said survive and not thrive. Now, if you're wanting to thrive and be happy, sorry, that's not in the charter goal, so you're just ass out. Some of the other goals include mandatory vaccines for everybody through worldwide universal health coverage, universal education to reduce inequalities and reach gender equality, which is leftist speak for DEI, indoctrination. And the UN is working on involving themselves in what and how much we are allowed to consume by having governments implement and enforce policies and regulations that include measures such as setting targets for reducing waste generation. So you can kiss that birthday steak dinner goodbye. Beef, it's no longer for dinner. It's only for the bourgeoisie.
By the year 2030, the UN would like to create social, economical, and political equality, regardless of age, gender, disability, race, ethnicity, religion, or economic status. They would also like to ensure equal opportunities and eliminate discriminatory laws, policies, and practices that promote inequality or segregation.
And just when you thought the UN couldn't get any more corrupt and evil, the Israel-Hamas conflict gave them the opportunity to show their true anti-Semitic colors, and it's not blue and white. The General Assembly of the United Nations initiated a resolution calling for a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, and in the resolution condemned Israel for its attacks on Gaza, but failed to reject and condemn the terrorist attacks by Hamas that actually started the conflict. To add insult to injury, one of the UN departments called the United Nations Relief Work Agency actually employs a number of Hamas members who openly celebrated the October 7th massacre of Israeli citizens. Educational literature from this agency includes Hamas terrorist propaganda that calls for killing of Jews.
The hearing focused on one agency in particular, where UN employees openly celebrated the October 7th attack on Israel. In its new report, the group UN Watch documents how 20 teachers and staff members with UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, rejoiced over the massacre of Israeli civilians in their social media accounts.
Allah is great. Allah is great. Reality surpasses our wildest dreams, posted UNRWA Gaza teacher Osama Ahmed.
UN Watch Executive Director Hillel Neuer told the Subcommittee on Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations that the celebration of the attack by UNRWA staff should not have been a surprise, considering what was already known about the agency's association with Hamas.
UNRWA staff regularly call to murder Jews and create teaching materials that glorify terrorism, encourage martyrdom, demonize Israelis, and incite anti-Semitism.
Last year, the UN issued a number of resolutions which are, in this case, admonishments against the country. And for the Middle East region, they included one resolution for Iran, one for Syria, and 15 against Israel. However, the UN is absolutely silent when it comes to human rights violations committed by China.
Neuer says that since the Hamas massacre, the overwhelming majority of statements by UN bodies and officials have pointed the finger at Israel following a pattern there in which Israel is held to a standard not applied to any other nation.
At the UN General Assembly last year, there was one resolution on Iran, one on Syria, one on North Korea, and 15 on Israel. 0 resolutions were adopted on China, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, and 180 other countries.
One of the UN's own departments submitted a report that accuses China of serious human rights abuses and crimes against humanity. China claimed that that report infringed on its national sovereignty, and amazingly, the UN sided with China and refused to even consider its own report. Finally, you have the United States carrying over a quarter of the UN's financial burden to keep it afloat. The US contributes over 27% of the UN's budget. And this doesn't include infrastructure and manpower that is loaned to the UN by the United States. All this to an organization that, by its very nature, is contrary to the precepts of our Constitution. It's well past time for the United States to leave the UN. The idea of the UN at its inception was sound. Early intervention to minimize conflict by impartial third-party mediators made sense, even today. However, the UN has morphed from that original goal to one that has people giving up their right to choose, the right to own personal property, and eventually their liberty, all for the mirage of a world government utopian society. This concludes today's presentation of Office of the Patriot. If you enjoyed the content, please take the time to like, subscribe, and share my channel on your social media. It is appreciated. And as always, have a blessed day and stay safe out there.